just give a minute or so for people to enter the room, as it were. Good afternoon. Welcome to a panel discussion co-hosted by the Center for Policy Research and the International Energy Agency. We are just letting people into the webinar, and we will start in just a minute or two once we get a few more people entering the meeting. So please bear with us for just a minute or two. Good afternoon to everyone, and good morning and evening to those in other time zones. We are just waiting for a few more audience members to join. We will probably start in about a minute or two. So I just ask your indulgence for another minute or so before we get started with this webinar. Okay, I think it's a couple of minutes past the starting time. So I think we'll get started. Once again, welcome to this webinar co-hosted by the International Energy Agency and the Center for Policy Research. The purpose of the discussion today is to discuss a new report, a very important new report by the International Energy Agency titled India Energy Outlook 2021. We have with us a representative from the IEA, who I'll introduce in a minute, and two very seasoned and distinguished and deeply engaged discussants. We are also expecting to be joined by the Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, who has had to go for another meeting, but he will join us when that is done. But I want to take a minute to set up the conversation by explaining why we at CPR are particularly excited about the discussion today. So the IEA's Outlook reports, which come every few years, if I'm not mistaken, the last India Outlook was 2015 or 2016, are a really good way to in one sort of glance, in a sense, take stock of the debates in the sector. There's a lot of useful information in here that's very effectively compiled. There's a lot of detail, including of national studies and debates, so it's a great basis for conversation. This year's report also has a discussion of the impacts of the COVID crisis and some well-informed thinking about what the implications of the crisis might be, which is very useful. And the core of the report is really around 3 or 4 scenarios that help us discuss what is going to happen going forward. And the way in which those scenarios are organized is around discussion of key sectors. So some of the messages that come out very clearly, which we will hear about in a minute, is how the emphasis is likely to shift, for example, from rapid changes in the power sector to rapid changes in other sectors like industry and transport. So it's a good way of kind of shining the spotlight on big picture trends in the sector. The scenarios are the way in which this report suggests we have a conversation about the future. There are 3 or 4 scenarios which we will hear about, and I want to particularly flag there is a sustainable development scenario, the SDS scenario, which talks about what it would take if India were to prioritize sustainable development, understood as meeting the SDGs, a subset of SDGs, and also aim to get to net zero carbon emissions in a reasonable time frame. So that is a particularly important scenario at the moment, given that the global conversation, while here in India, we are justifiably concerned with energy access, energy for development and growth, and so on and so forth. We are in a year where the global conversation is around accelerated mitigation, around updated NDCs, and in particular around net zero. So the IEA scenario is one of the few that explicitly engages this conversation, and there may be other such studies in the future, but at the moment, it's pretty thin on the ground. So that is something else that I think it would be very useful to unpack in the course of this event. So I propose that we just get started. I don't want to take too much time. I'm going to introduce our speaker from the IEA first, and then after that, I will introduce our other discussants. When the secretary comes, I will briefly introduce him and allow him a few words as well. So I'm delighted to welcome Tim Gould from the IEA, who's head of the Division of Energy Supply and Investment Outlooks. He is co-lead of the World Energy Outlook, of which this report on India is in a sense, a country-specific deep dive. He leads not only this report, but also the World Energy Investment Report. And the IEA is, as we all know, quite a shaper of the global conversation. We all engage with it, on occasion criticize it, but we can't certainly ignore the pronouncements the IEA makes. And so I'm delighted to ask Tim to please present this report and set up the discussion, maybe in about 20, 25 minutes, Tim, if that's okay. So please.
Certainly. Well, look, thank you very much, Navroz. Many thanks also to all of those who have joined today, and to our very distinguished panelists, who I look forward very much to hearing from. And just to add, Navroz, we very much welcome the engagement. We certainly read all the criticism. We discuss it a lot amongst ourselves, and in fact, that enriches our work a lot. So I look forward to hearing reactions and views also to this latest set of analytical projections. And you rightly emphasized that this is scenario work, so we don't have a single view about the future of Indian energy, but we do hopefully have a way of structuring our thinking on the possible avenues and the choices that lead in certain directions. And I'm aware, of course, that this is a very knowledgeable audience, so I will not dwell on aspects that we might have to emphasize for a more international crowd. But I would like to just highlight some aspects of the backdrop, particularly, you recalled, Navroz, the previous India Energy Outlook that we conducted in 2015, and so much has changed since then, particularly, of course, on access, but we're also very much following the boom of investment in renewables, led by some ambitious policy targets, and also areas of energy efficiency, the rollout of LED lighting and so on. But we're equally aware of some pressing problems, some of which COVID made more difficult to resolve, reliability of power, issues with the discoms. And even though LPG is available, it isn't always the primary fuel for cooking for many Indians, particularly in rural areas. And we should also, in framing our conversation, recall that energy is at the root of many positive aspects of Indian life, but it's also a source of, the major source of the air pollutants. And we take this scenario approach, and I'll be talking a little bit about a few of those. I would like to emphasize once again, we don't have a forecast for what may happen in India over the coming decades, but we do have a number of exploratory scenarios, by which I mean that we fix some starting conditions, and then we see which way they lead the Indian energy system over the coming decades. And we have one important normative scenario that Navroz already mentioned, the sustainable development scenario, where we fix the endpoint. So we fix the achievement of certain sustainable development objectives related to energy. And then we work back to see how they can be realized. And in a sense, by comparing the outcomes of those exploratory targets, those exploratory scenarios with the more normative approach, you can see what more would be required from the Indian policymakers, from Indian society, from Indian companies, in order to reach those objectives. And a first task or a first question that we had to answer when we put this together was really mapping out possible ways out of the pandemic or the crisis caused by the global pandemic. And a scenario I'm going to be mentioning quite a few times is our stated policy scenario, in which we assume that the pandemic is really brought under control over the course of 2021. And then this is designed to have a sort of balanced assessment of the direction that India's existing policies and policy targets might take the energy economy. Not all of those targets, particularly the more aspirational ones, are met in full or necessarily in the envisaged time period, because we try and take into account a range of real-world constraints that might affect how they are implemented and how quickly they are implemented. And the result is this: after a 5% fall in energy demand in 2020, quite a rapid rebound in India's energy use, growing more than 1/3 over the next decade. But of course, that's not the only way that India could evolve over the coming decade. We did have a downside case in which there are more prolonged economic impacts from the pandemic, and this delayed recovery scenario has a number of downsides for India, but it does also undercut some of India's hard-won gains in terms of the fight against energy poverty, as some lower income households are forced to fall back on more polluting and inefficient sources of energy. On the other side, there is that upside case, a faster rebound in the economy, but also a more complete realization of India's stated policy objectives. So this India vision case introduces a theme that we'll come back to a few times in this presentation, the way that government policies shape outcomes. And interestingly, what we found when we were modeling this India vision case is that we couldn't meet all of India's targets simultaneously. So in particular, we were not able to hit, for example, the renewables target, but also have the large volumetric increase in coal production that is on the table. So in this case, even though economic growth is higher, a faster move away from inefficient solid biomass, faster introduction of more efficient technologies means that higher economic growth coexists with a lower trajectory for energy demand. And that's without any loss of the energy services available to the population. But whichever way things evolve from here, India will really be central to the conversation about global trends. Over the last 20 years, China was very much in the lead when it came to driving global energy developments. This is from our stated policy scenario. You can see how India is out in front. And that's a function of various things, most of which are very well known to an Indian audience. But I would highlight that in our view, as China becomes a more service-driven economy and India builds up its national infrastructure, there is this pivot in global manufacturing towards South Asia, towards India. And that industrialization is an extremely important force in our projections. And it comes in at a sort of twin brother, if you like, industrialization and urbanization. So over the next 20 years, in our view, around 270 million people added to India's urban population. I mean, that's a vast change. That's a vast increase. It's another 13 Mumbais between now and 2040. And that underpins an extremely rapid build-up in India's building stock. Residential floor space, you can see, more than doubles. And with that comes a large increase in demand for construction materials, most of which are quite energy intensive. You can see steel and cement on the screen, as well as plastics and other manufactured goods. And I would like to just stop here and highlight the importance of the model of urbanization that India follows for all sorts of energy trends, whether cities are compact or sprawling, whether they're formal or informal, whether they're governed by energy efficient building codes or not. These are decisions that build in very long-lived patterns of energy demand. And there's also very large implications for appliance use, particularly for electricity use. The one that we highlight here, and I'll just minimize that part of my screen so I can see what's, is air conditioners. A very large increase in the AC stock in India projected over the next couple of decades. And we'll come back to the implications of this, but the efficiency of those appliances becomes an extremely important variable for India's electricity demand, especially its peak electricity demand. And this is an area where we are, of course, conscious of the Indian government's efforts through the India Cooling Action Plan. For us, that's one of the big topics where policies can play an enormously influential role. So what are the implications of this outlook for the various fuels and technologies that make up India's energy system? This is how the fortunes fare in the stated policy scenario. And what you're looking at here is 1/4 of the increase in global energy demand over the period to 2040. And this already represents quite a big reordering of India's energy priorities in the decades to come. So renewables meet the largest share of growth, not only in the power sector, but also by harnessing the potential for direct use of modern bioenergy in end-use sectors, whether that's biomass in industrial applications, or biogases for clean cooking, or biofuels for transport. Oil takes the next largest share, and this mainly, of course, for transport. Some 300 million additional vehicles of all types are added to India's fleet between now and 2040. Trucks make a very important contribution, half the growth in demand for road transport. Electrification, obviously a big part of the policy conversation about the outlook for transport, has quite a large impact on the market for 2- and 3-wheelers, slightly more subdued outlook in our view for passenger cars. And so if you translate that column into million barrels of oil per day, that's an extra 4 million barrels a day of Indian oil demand, making India the largest growth market for oil worldwide in this scenario. On to coal. Over the past 3 decades, almost 3/4 of the growth in global coal demand, in Indian coal demand, went to power generation. But the picture now is quite dramatically different. Growth slows, now concentrated in industry, especially for iron and steel and cement. Gases, natural gas, and indeed gases of all kinds, play increasingly important roles in India's energy future in this scenario. And they're growing from a low base, as we're all aware. And we go some way towards meeting these targets for a 15% share by 2030. Gas, an increasingly important fuel for India's industrial growth, also in city gas distribution, transport and cooking, and so on, but not a major contributor to the power sector. Nuclear, also a significant role. I mean, we're all aware of the new reactor that was recently commissioned in Gujarat, several more under construction. There's some steady growth from that source. And the only element that declines, and of course this decline is a positive signal for India's development trajectory, is as people move away from solid biomass. Now I'd like to say a few words about electricity. So one element of continuity in all of the scenarios in which we examine is strong growth in electricity demand. But in other respects, the future looks quite different from the past. And up until recently, electricity consumption and coal demand, they walked together. both nearly tripled between the year 2000 and the year 2019. But now they part company. So instead, these are the shares in power generation, and you see that convergence between a declining share for coal and a rising share for solar PV. And it's really solar PV and other renewables that dominate the sort of investment outlook for the power sector. And that kind of transformation is even more rapid in the sustainable development scenario, which, as I mentioned, that's one in which India gets on course for objectives, including the Paris Agreement. That means a course that's consistent with net zero emissions during the 2060s. And in that scenario, solar and wind generation already or the share of solar and wind generation overtake that of coal already within the next 10 years. So investment in the power sector is already more than half of total energy spending in India, but this would need to double over the next 10 years to meet India's targets, its needs, and realize this kind of transformation in the generation mix. And this means tackling some risks around the discoms, around land acquisition, some elements of regulatory and contract uncertainty. And it would also mean continued regulatory innovation of the sort that we saw last year with the first round-the-clock renewable energy auction. So these kinds of approaches are vital because the rest of the system, it cannot stand still as solar rises. And more than any other country in the world, India will face a huge increase in the need for flexibility in its power system. So how to illustrate that increased demand for flexibility? Well, what we chose to do here is to look at how much does the rest of the system need to change from hour to hour in order to compensate for the variability in output from wind and solar PV. And this is the system, this is the situation that we have today. Each one of these dots is, in a sense, an hourly variation for each of the hours in the year. And you can see that the rest of the system might need to adjust by plus or minus 5% from hour to hour because the sun rises or it goes down or the wind picks up or the wind dies down. But this variability increases sharply already within the next 10 years, by which time the hourly adjustments are in the range of plus 20% to minus 20%. And in some states in India, particularly those at the leading edge of renewables deployment, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, they will feel this earlier than others. And let's remember, this is just the supply side. There's also growing variability on the demand side as well, with that large early evening peak in electricity demand as millions of people come home, switch on their air conditioning and other appliances. And that means that India needs to really mobilize all forms of flexibility to ensure that the transformation in its power system is a secure one. Of course, the grid has a massive role to play there. And indeed, spending on networks overtakes spending on capacity growth within the next few years in our projections. But I think there are many other aspects to flexibility that we could come back to. One is, how can you, in a sense, retool the coal-fired fleet in order to play a role in varying its own output in accordance with the needs of the system? The roles of hydropower, the roles of the gas-fired capacity. But an area that we've particularly highlighted in the analysis is how India becomes a global leader in battery deployment to align that solar-led generation peak in the middle of the day with that early evening peak in demand. There are also some, in a sense, some more traditional energy security concerns that arise from that stated policies scenario analysis, and namely India's continued high reliance on imported fuels. You look on the vertical axis, this is now expressed in dollars. So this is, in a sense, the value of domestic output versus the amount that India has to pay for imported fuels. You can see that the amount below the line is greater than the amount above. That has implications, of course, for all sorts of economic indicators. In recent years, energy has accounted for almost 1/3 of India's total imports by value. We, of course, took into account various policy measures and initiatives looking to stimulate aspects of domestic fuel production, and they do bear some fruit. You can see that in our projections for offshore gas production from the Krishna-Godavari basin, and indeed some higher domestic coal output. However, these efforts really don't keep pace with demand, and this means a rising import bill in this scenario, growing exposure to global market conditions and possible market volatility. And as you can see from this slide, those vulnerabilities are particularly strong when it comes to oil, where projected dependence on imports rises from around 75% today to some 90% by 2040. Now, were India to follow a different path, were it to follow a sustainable development scenario, this picture would look quite different. That requirement for the requirement for imported fuels would be much lower. The import bill is reduced by well over half, and that's a cumulative saving of around $1.4 trillion over the period to 2040. And there are some warning signs too in terms of emissions, even though we would like to continually remind an audience, particularly an international audience, in per capita terms, India remains one of the lowest emitters on the planet. So per capita CO2 emissions in India today are only about 40% of the global average, and they remain well below that in the stated policy scenario. And what you're looking at on the screen is in fact a major Indian success story. So India's electricity demand in this scenario grows by about 150% over the next 2 decades. But the new power plants that are built to meet this rise leave a very light environmental footprint. This is a tribute to the remarkable rise of solar and other low emissions technologies. But this, of course, is not the whole story. That rapid growth in renewables, that's enough effectively to cover the growth in electricity demand. But there's still an existing fleet, existing coal-fired fleet in the main. Those coal-fired plants are on average around 15 years old, and so many of them continue to run throughout the next 20 years in this scenario. And we also need to look outside the power sector for, in a sense, the rest of the energy-related emissions story. Here we look at the emissions associated with all of the industrial facilities, cars, trucks, the existing building stock, and that's a gradual downward trajectory as equipment is replaced or new cars are entering the fleet as old ones are retired and so on. But what we need to have in mind is that India's industrial expansion and the expansion of its transport infrastructure result in very significant additional emissions despite a range of policy efforts. And so in that stated policy scenario, most of India's projected emissions by the late 2030s come from new factories, new trucks, new cars, new buildings, and other sources that don't exist today. And as I think we are all aware, those kinds of transport and industrial emissions, areas like road freight or steel or cement, they're much more challenging to develop in a sustainable manner than power generation, where India has made huge strides. But I think the other takeaway from this slide, given the contingency of this projection on things that don't yet exist, is a huge policy opportunity to steer India onto a more secure and sustainable course. And before closing, I would just like to highlight some elements of that accelerated transformation. Many of these are already visible in India's energy policy vision today. And this push for a new model of low carbon inclusive growth is kind of extended and given additional impetus in our sustainable development scenario. So as is easily possible to imagine, solar, clean electricity, battery technologies, I mean, they play a huge part. But in practice, India would need to deploy a whole range of technologies and approaches in order to get itself onto that sustainable development trajectory. And one key component of that would be bringing that clean electricity into areas of India's end-use demand where it is less prominent today, notably through a faster rise in electric mobility. But I think there's also significant potential for greater electrification on the industrial side. In relation to industry, we highlight here significant potential for more efficient industrial processes, as well as a strong rise in more sustainable fuels. You can see biogas is on the screen, but I think there's increasing excitement internationally and also in India with the new National Hydrogen Energy Mission about the potential for low carbon hydrogen to play a significant role in India's energy future. Of course, all of this comes with a price tag. So the additional investment required in clean energy technologies in the sustainable development scenario, it's significant. So it's $1.4 trillion above the level in the stated policy scenario. But you may recall that that $1.4 trillion is also the sum that is saved in lower fuel import bills by India in this scenario. And there's really a huge commercial, industrial employment opportunity here as well. The market for solar PV, wind turbine, battery, electrolyzer equipment, that's at $80 billion a year by 2040 in the sustainable development scenario. And India really becomes major markets for deployment of a range of clean energy technologies. There are opportunities there for innovation. There's opportunities there for domestic manufacturing as well. So I will now just say a couple of concluding words before moving on to hearing from our distinguished colleagues. So I hope that this presentation has given a sense of the dynamism and sheer scale of India's energy development. I mean, at the International Energy Agency, we're used to trying to get our heads around, big numbers when we look at global trends. But the sheer size of India's potential growth, some of the numbers involved there are truly, truly impressive. The rise of renewable energy led by solar, very central to our outlook. Speed of that rise, though, let's all be aware of some aspects of the investment outlook, the investment climate, as well as not just what happens in generation, but also in infrastructure and various sources of flexibility. Much of the conversation around India's energy future rightly focuses on the transformation underway in the electricity sector. But it's really essential to pay attention to other parts of the equation as well. So industry, transport are really driving many of the trends that we see in global fuel markets, as well as India's emissions. And that leads me to the reminder, in a sense, that even as solar pushes India's clean energy transitions forward, there is really no single or simple answer to a wide-ranging and thoroughgoing energy transition for India. It will really need a wide range of innovative and sustainable technologies to mitigate risks to its energy security and environmental performance. And the final thing is just to say that the size of the prize is absolutely huge. I mean, a low carbon inclusive path for India will bring multiple benefits for India's citizens, but we're also acutely aware that it will be a beacon for many other developing economies to show that robust economic growth is fully compatible with an increasing pace of emissions reductions and the achievement of other sustainable development goals. And as India makes its choices and travels along its energy path, it can certainly count on the enduring support and partnership of the International Energy Agency. And with that, I would like to thank everyone very much for their attention and pass back to you, Navroz.
Thank you so very much, Tim, for that really clear presentation of a very sweeping topic and a very sweeping report. I was particularly struck by your framing that India has actually a choice in how we move forward, and the implications of that choice are considerable in terms of things like fuel imports, in terms of potential development outcomes, of course, in terms of mitigation, but that the choice has to be made deliberately. These are not things that will happen automatically, but the consequences are immense, and you put those out quite starkly, which I think is very useful in provoking a deeper dive into how one pivots, whether India pivots, and what it will take to make that sort of pivot. So thank you. I think it's a great setup for the conversation. I'm now going to turn to our two discussants. As I mentioned earlier, the Secretary MoEF may well join in when he's concluded with his other meeting. Before I introduce the two discussants, I just want to note that we welcome comments from the participants, and thank you all so much for taking time this early evening. I see some people have already started putting in questions to the Q&A box. So the chat box is not active for participants, but you can put in your questions on Q&A. And after the discussants and the secretary, we will curate as many of the questions as we can, and we'll try and leave as much time as we can for questions. So please do start populating your questions in the Q&A box. I now turn to our discussants, the first of whom is Ajay Shankar, who many of us will know, who's currently at the Energy and Resources Institute, but of course has been a distinguished member of the Indian Administrative Service and a practitioner in government for many years. He retired as Secretary, Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, and prior to that spent many, many years in the power sector as a key architect of very important moments, the Electricity Act, rural electrification, and the National Solar Mission. So we are delighted to have Ajay Shankar here with us. After Ajay Shankar has spoken for maybe 7 to 10 minutes, I will turn to Tejal Kanitkar, who is an associate professor at the National Institute for Advanced Sciences in Bangalore. Tejal is an interdisciplinary scholar, and I have had the pleasure of interacting with her from her time at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. She's been very active in the climate debate, but also, of course, in the Indian energy debate, and combines a background in engineering with a lot of attention to the sorts of modeling conversations that we are discussing today. So we're delighted to have Dr. Tejal Kanitkar with us as well. So maybe I can turn to you first, Mr. Ajay Shankar, for 7 to 10 minutes, and then to Dr. Tejal Kanitkar.
Thank you. Let me begin by complimenting Tim and his team for the clarity of the presentation, but more than that, the actual report, which is of the highest standards that one expects from the IEA. So it's balanced, it's nuanced, it has really taken an in-depth dive into very complex issues, and I would strongly recommend those who are attending to make the effort to reading all of it. But the report and going through the report got me thinking of many of the issues which get thrown up when you go through the whole report. So my opening comment would be of what the report recognizes, and which is India's extraordinary achievement over the last 10 odd years, I would put it like that. Because I recall around the year 2000, the IEA report had said that India would succeed in taking access to all households in the most optimistic scenario by 2040, business as usual by about 2050. We finally managed to do it before 2020. I mean, and the IEA recognizes that this is historically unprecedented, this kind of extension of access. Navroz, you mentioned the solar mission. So when we began in 2010, The target was 20,000 megawatts by 2020, 22. To everybody, it appeared unachievable at that point of time and unaffordable. Today, we well beyond that number, and today the aspiration and the goals on renewable energy have moved up to 170,000 in 22, maybe because of COVID, it may get delayed by a year or so, and 450,000 by, say, 2030 or a little later. So that again is a phenomenal change. Then another phenomenal change, and again we can be quite satisfied with that, is that for the first time we have spare generating capacity in the system. So 24/7 reliable supply is feasible today in terms of availability of generating capacity. The problems lie in need for some investments in the distribution infrastructure or in terms of handling the commercial issues or the viability issues in the electricity sector. So these are huge achievements and certainly seemed very difficult even 10 years back. So going forward, I would like to make the point that I think major transitions are conceivable, they are feasible and may well turn out to be affordable. So I think this report is a good trigger for having more serious conversations and more serious debates and analysis on what these things would involve and what the implications are. Now, to my mind, the first objective, apart from 24/7 reliable supply for electricity, is the use of clean energy for cooking. It's a basic SDG goal. One could well argue that that should have taken priority over getting access of electricity to all households. So we can do it, and we should do it. And if it requires some targeted subsidies for people who are in the weaker sections to replace the gas cylinders that they have, we should look at it as to how to do it, how we can afford it, because it is really important from a gender perspective, from air pollution. And it is something which is now feasible in the next few years because the gas cylinders have reached all households. So that's something in the very short run, next 3-4 years. But going forward, we need to think through the bigger questions. And while thinking through the bigger questions, we also need to recognize a point which was made in passing by Tim, but it's implicit in the report, that when you make choices, you sometimes get locked into a certain path. And so it is good to think through what the implications of a choice today are, not over the next 5-7 years, but over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And in the context of the global good that we are also committed to, which is saving the planet from the challenge of global warming. So each one of these I'll pick up one by one. So the state of Gujarat has taken a very sensible decision that they will not develop any more coal-fired stations. So supposing as a country we went into a discussion that what is in the pipeline, fine, it's a pipeline, it's a committed investment. But do we really want to put a moratorium on the commencement of any new coal-fired stations, and what the implications of that are? And there is a recent TERI study which says that if you take the share of renewables up to 30-40%, the overall system cost doesn't rise. In fact, it makes the case that it actually falls, or it's the most cost-effective path. The calculations and models need to be gone into. But if we go forward and look at a transition of electricity being free of fossil fuels altogether, then what are the implications? And at what point of time, what happens to the prices of batteries or storage, that it doesn't become an option which imposes additional costs. Now, the surprising development or the surprising success of the solar mission till now has been that it has been driven by purely private investment, and the costs it has imposed on the system have been affordable, manageable. Some would argue that it has been insignificant. Some would say, yes, there is some cost. But certainly, if you look at the financial health of the distribution companies, renewables have at best a marginal role to play there. So going forward, if we were to make the transition towards 100% fossil fuel electricity, what are the implications? What are the price points at which becomes the least cost option? Or if there is a cost at certain price points, what are the scale of those costs? Are they affordable, unaffordable? What are the implications? Now, the moment we think through that, then comes the next big area, which is surface transport. Now, again, in theory, surface transport can be fully driven by electricity. Now, the technology is there as far as cars are concerned. It's already, in terms of per kilometer life cycle costs in India, it is already the cheapest way of moving on cars. That transition could well happen with trucks or hybrid trucks in the next few years globally in terms of technology. So do we move more aggressively on EV transition? And if we do so, then what does it entail? And if it entails a investment in terms of the highway and charging infrastructure, etc., at what point of time we will bring it in and what point of time it becomes either commercially attractive or the costs are marginal. Because if you make all of surface transport based on electricity, you get all of electricity from renewables at some point of time, then a huge transition towards net carbon zero has already taken place. Now, the issue of lock-in then becomes important, because if we go very aggressively in investment in the gas infrastructure for transport, then we need to consider whether that's the best time. I mean, how much aggressively we should go there or focus on gas for getting into industrial uses and in household uses. And again, in household uses for cooking, can we begin a process where we start encouraging the use of electricity, because that can then lead to a stage where cooking is free of carbon emissions because the electricity comes from renewables. So I think we need to get into more serious conversations and discussions and analysis on the building blocks of moving towards net carbon zero, rather than going the other route, I mean, which also has merits and some people may argue for that. Say like UK and France did, net carbon neutral by 2050, and they are now working out the things they need to do to achieve it. So I think a discussion on the building blocks and what it takes would be the right way to move forward, even if at a political level some decision gets taken that, okay, this is a target date we will aspire for or give for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
And I hope I've stuck to my 7 odd minutes that you'd said.
No, you absolutely. Thank you. It was very concise, and I particularly like. I mean, there are several things to take, but I like both the idea of focusing on the building blocks as well as the sense of optimism you carry into this, that perhaps these things may prove not to be quite as demanding as everybody thought with the experience of the solar mission behind us. That, of course, is a question for analysis and so on, but I think it's worth starting with at least a hopeful spirit, but diving deep into the details of the building blocks and not being falsely optimistic at the same time. I think it's a very sensible approach. Let me turn it over to Tejal. Tejal, please.
Thanks, Navroz. Thank you very much to the Center for Policy Research for this opportunity. It has given me a reason to specifically take time out and look at the world energy model once again, which I had looked at some time back. And the report itself is also very comprehensive. I echo my co-panelists in saying that it covers a lot of ground in terms of the changes that the country has seen in the last few years, and especially what the pandemic has meant for the economy in general, and the energy sector, of course, in particular. It is, I know, never very easy to simulate a disruption, even after the fact. We all know that there is always a degree of uncertainty, even when things are relatively stable. But during a crisis, there is a multifold increase in the degree of uncertainty. And constructing scenarios in such a situation is quite a difficult job. So one is not quite certain about the direction that policy will take to recover from the crisis, or the degree of structural shifts that have been caused by such a prolonged disruption that may influence future trajectories in as yet unknown ways. So at the outset, I mean, I really want to congratulate and thank the IEA for providing a concrete basis for this conversation. In my comments, I want to focus on just a few aspects of the report and the underlying model that is used to construct the scenarios that were presented. Most of my comments are actually related to the underlying developmental assumptions and exogenous macroeconomic drivers in the world energy model. I think it's important to look at these critically to understand why the results look the way they do. And the report itself also focuses quite significantly on some of the trade-offs, co-benefits, etc., in terms of development. And it's been a very important part of India's vision in terms of what its climate policy as well as its energy policy. The understanding that development is really at the focal point of our understanding of how we deal with climate change. So the world energy model, I understand that it's a simulation model, and it allows the creation of what-if scenarios that were presented earlier by Tim. It's a computationally straightforward and user-friendly model. It's much less complicated as compared to all the complex general equilibrium models that we typically have, which are generally black box. You don't know what is going on inside these models. The world energy model, on the contrary, is transparent. The assumptions are easy to check and change if one wants to. That's how the scenarios are constructed. But I want to flag that I think the simple structure itself also limits what the model can therefore provide answers to. So in the world energy model, for example, economic drivers, demographics, technological developments are exogenous to the model and therefore based on a set of normative assumptions. Now, these inputs come from a variety of assumptions, either on past data or other models, for example, the UN's population models or growth estimates by the government of the region that is being modeled. But the exogenous nature of these key variable means that the feedback impact of structural changes and policy choices on key economic and demographic variables cannot be accounted for. So let us take, for example, poverty and employment. I mean, it's arguably are the most important things at the center for policy making for a developing country, in India in particular. And to be fair, there is a clear explication in the report of increasing incomes as a basic assumption for economic growth. There are also exogenous estimates of potential employment impacts that are given in the report. However, for any given policy option and resulting growth trajectory, there will be multiplier effects, and these will depend on multiple economic parameters. For example, the GDP growth assumptions in the STEPS scenario, which is, it's not a baseline scenario, as is typically what is constructed as baseline scenarios in other models. It's a stated policy scenario. But the GDP growth assumptions in the STEPS and the sustainable development scenarios are the same. Now, I understand that this is because the low emission outcomes are expected to be achieved in the sustainable development scenario while keeping the developmental or rather growth outcomes the same. But however, to achieve the same macroeconomic outcome while limiting emissions will require substantial structural shifts in the economy, which will have implications for poverty alleviation as well as feedback impacts on overall growth. So the model by its very structure does not allow for this. While the report does deal with this in the narrative, there are broad sort of disclaimers about this. It's not clear how or whether they are quantitatively included in the model or even outside the model. Now, another element of this is the investments, for example, on clean energy that are envisaged across scenarios. Now, the report separates the investment by government, which is a proportion of the GDP spent on the energy sector, and investments by public and private corporations. But will this be new and additional investment? I mean, I think that these are some of the things that need, they're perhaps part of the model, but probably need more clarity. Will this be new and additional investment? Given the scale of investment that is envisaged, even in the STEPS scenario, it would be, I think, reasonable to assume that not all of it can be new and additional, and substantial amounts are likely to come from restructuring existing finance. So how this finance is restructured and redirected across the economy will have a significant impact across sectors, on incomes, and also on income distribution. Will extra government finance that is envisaged in the SDS as compared to steps come from the restructuring of budget allocations, for example? So the manner of this restructuring will have implications for poverty alleviation targets, for achieving equity targets. So if one is really to take into consideration co-benefits and trade-offs, then there should be an attempt to quantify these impacts. It's not enough to simply qualify these as potential implications and suggest policy nudges to take account of them. And the same goes for assumptions of population. And this is not also just about the World Energy Model. I think the modeling community in general is, a little Malthusian in the way in which it handles population. It's very often assumed in energy models as an independent variable, which it is not. It depends on levels of development, amenities, etc. And the world population prospect models, for example, take this into account while they estimate populations for the future. However, when you separate the two in energy models, you have the population, which is an exogenous input, and you have GDP growth as another exogenous input. They're not connected with each other. The GDP assumptions across scenarios perhaps are likely to contradict the assumptions made in the world population prospect models, rendering the population estimates that you've used unusable, because they might have used different GDP outcomes than you did for your assumptions. So we really need to rethink how to handle population and its distribution in all energy models, because this becomes a very fundamental driver of energy demand, given that the way in which it is used in models. And if we are not using it properly, then it becomes, it's an important issue that, especially for India, we need to deal with. A few last comments. Coming back to employment, I think there is a huge discussion in the report on employment. While, however, it's not very clear whether there is a difference that has been made between jobs and employment. There's a growing body of literature that establishes the difference between the two, especially in the energy sector, in terms of the differences between the fossil fuel industry and the renewable sector. But assuming, however, that the analysis does take this into consideration, I mean, the person years as a metric to determine employment, it is not clear whether the IEA analysis considers the renewable energy sector jobs in deployment or in operation, or in manufacturing, or both. So if so, it is not clear what these assumptions are. Even in steps for growth in India's RE manufacturing capability over the period under consideration. And this connects to the assumptions that and the presentation you made about import dependence, for example. It has implications for import dependence, which in the RE sector also is currently very high. So if you're simply also shifting the import bill from oil and gas or coal to renewable energy, where we are importing most of our panels, and even now, as we stand now, battery technology, this is how is this trade-off handled is not very clear. There is an assumption that between steps and SDS, the additional cost of RE will be offset by a reduction in the import bill for oil, for example. But this depends critically on the assumption about how much of that RE equipment will actually be domestically manufactured and how much of it will be imported, and what is the difference in that import bill. But even then, there are, for example, in the STEPS scenario, the report says that there will be 1 million jobs created in the RE sector, and in the SDS sector, it will be 1.6 million. And in the report itself, it is mentioned clearly that there are 0.5 million official employees in the coal mining sector alone. So even assuming that there will be only a partial displacement in this sector, we also have to consider the downstream effects on something like freight transportation, for example, of which coal transportation is a large proportion. So jobs in the thermal power plants, washeries, refineries, other allied sectors, not to mention the multiplier effects that I spoke of earlier. So I think these are some of the important questions that the country needs to deal with when it talks about energy and development and sustainable development goals. So, I mean, I want to sort of, I know I'm out of time, so I just want to say, end with just one last point, which is, I think, the implication between the steps and the SDS scenarios. And I understand that these are scenarios and not forecasts. But, if you do a comparison between the two, not with any other baseline, the investment in the energy sector in steps itself is expected to be around $155 billion in 2030, about $260 billion by 2040. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is 3% of the envisaged GDP under the scenarios. And the report says that SDS will require actually a 35% higher investment as compared to steps. Now, there are implications, of course, for development. However, even if we keep that aside, given the difference in emissions that is envisaged between these two scenarios, it would mean a cost of avoided carbon of around 50 to 70 dollars per ton of carbon dioxide between the two scenarios. And one must remember, of course, that STEPS is not really a least cost baseline. It includes the costs of coal-based power that are already higher due to the coal cess, as well as higher transportation costs that cross-subsidizes clean rail-based passenger transport. So the additional cost in STEPS itself is higher, which would imply an even higher cost of avoided carbon. Now, this is actually a significantly high cost for a developing country. In an international situation where most clean energy finance is being actually given in the form of loans, it becomes critically important for India to rethink both, I think, in terms of how it's going to finance a transition in this country without necessarily trading off on all of the other developmental objectives. And I want to end, therefore, with just a suggestion. Given that both the IEA report, as well as all of us here, accept that there are trade-offs involved in the process of a transition, it would be useful to have a scenario which is a development scenario, in which the objective is to meet developmental outcomes of income growth, access to amenities, housing, equity, etc. The energy side of the scenario would depend on using resources to achieve these outcomes and their implied energy demand at least cost, with domestically available resources, given that the potential benefit of this in terms of achieving positive labor absorption outcomes, for example, leading to income changes and etc., would be easier to achieve. So given the shifts in energy prices, even such a scenario would already have a fair bit of clean energy initiatives, but they would be based on prices alone and not on policy pushes. Policy scenarios can then be constructed over and above this. This, I think, would provide a wider range and potentially a better understanding of the trade-offs and co-benefits of choices that are available to India. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tejal. Very rich set of comments from both our discussants. We haven't had a sighting of the secretary yet, but I think we'll forge ahead, and as and when he joins, we'll ask him to intervene. He has seen Dr. Tim Gould's presentation, so hopefully he'll have some context for the discussion, but of course he won't have had the benefit of these comments. So I'm sure that Tim has several responses to some of these discussion comments, but I'm actually going to ask you to see if you can weave them into some of the discussions from the floor so that we can get the audience a little bit more engaged relatively soon. So I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions from the audience members, and we can use that as a starting point, beginning with Tim, and then bring in the other panelists as well. So there's one question that starts with this issue of net zero and points out that there is about a 450 MTOE increase from fossil fuels in the STEPS scenario as compared to 225 MTOE from renewable energy. So the STEPS scenario and I think the India Vision scenario both see a very strong role of fossil fuels. Now, I guess the question then is that sort of trajectory even remotely compatible with the net zero emissions world? And what exactly is the nature of the shift to get to a net zero world, which the SDS tries to work into the story? Maybe I can just add to that my observation from the graphs in the report, that the SDS scenario, if I'm not mistaken, has emissions basically bending downwards almost immediately. And so, you know, what are the kinds of assumptions that it would take to make that happen? So maybe a round of comments on that, starting with Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Navroz, and you know, sincere thanks to Ajay and to Tejal for those very rich set of comments. I will try and weave, as you suggested, some responses to those into my other answers. But just on the direct question, yes, the questioner is completely correct. I mean, that kind of trajectory is not compatible with a net zero outcome. That would imply an increase of some 50% in India's CO2 emissions over the next two decades. And so one of the messages from the report is that despite all of the transformative things that are happening in the power sector and some very interesting developments elsewhere, you know, just that the scale of India's growth is putting pressure on fuel use, fossil fuel use, and leads to that continued rise in emissions. Now, let it be said that even in 2040, in that scenario, India's per capita emissions are still below the global average. But you know, what we would highlight is that there are, in a sense, a compendium of security-related, water-related, and pollution-related, and CO2 emissions-related reasons why India may not wish to end up in that world. And what we would like to highlight is some of the things that could be done differently. And you're completely right, Navroz, that in the, you know, we have always emphasized in the sustainable development scenario the importance of early action. So the scenarios part companies quite quickly. You know, in terms of CO2 emissions, there is a bit of a rebound after last year for India's CO2 emissions in the sustainable development scenario, but they never get back to 2019 levels. That's an extremely demanding scenario that would require very early action to ramp up the deployment of a range of low carbon technologies, of course, in the power sector, but also outside, to ensure that wherever possible, the things that are added to the system leave as light an environmental footprint as possible. We understand that's not possible in all sectors, but we would see significant scope to ensure that, for example, new buildings are built with very high you know, environmental performance and efficiencies kind of built in. There is scope for a range of appliances, likewise, to step up. And India has shown that when the policies are in place, when the push is there, when you leverage the power of centralized government procurement, some of this stuff can actually happen quite quickly. And I very much share the observation made by Ajay at the beginning to say, yes, when there's a following wind and when the policies are aligned and when the technologies come in, you know, some things can happen quite fast. In the sustainable development scenario, across the range of, across the entire energy sector, you need to have those sorts of alignments to achieve those kinds of outcomes.
Thank you so much, Tim. Would either of the panelists like to come in on this? And I see that the secretary is about to join, but until he gets his system going, would either of you like to come in on this? Please.
As I had mentioned earlier, one way of looking at these things are that when do you get a certain tipping point or an inflection point, and then what it does to the scenario. And say the solar mission is a good example, that when we began, 17 rupees was the rate fixed by CERC. We are down to below 3. And that is because of we went in for competitive procurement and we took the maximum advantage of the global decline in prices. Now we could make another transition, which is to use the PLI in manufacturing to genuinely become Atmanirbhar both in batteries and panels. It can be done, it's not difficult. A couple of policy decisions could lead to that emerging in just a few years, because you could say that, okay, starting 24, we will do procurement of plants built in India, where 100% is the solar panel is made in India minus you know, some marginal imports. So similarly for batteries, that they have to be built in India. So that import dependence can fall very rapidly. And again, if you get volumes, as we saw in the LED case we referred to by Tim, prices would come down. So we could get much lower prices both in battery storage as well as in the solar panels. So many of the traditional assumptions about cost implications then become completely dated. So that's the way I would like to think through on the things that, and as I would repeat that one has to look at the additional cost only one has worked through the market mechanism to get the least cost in favor of the transition that is desirable.
Thank you. Tejal, I'll come to you in just a second. Let me just pause to welcome the Secretary, Ministry of Environment and Forests, Shri R.P. Gupta. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I'll just briefly mention that Mr. Gupta is, of course, current Secretary, Environment and Forests, but has in the past been Special Secretary at Niti Aayog, and prior to that also in the Ministry of Coal. So he comes to us with a background in a whole range of sectors, not only energy, but transport, health, coal, and so on. So very useful width of experience for this conversation. Mr. Gupta, we've had a presentation from Mr. Gould. We've had some comments from Mr. Ajay Shankar and Dr. Tejal Kanitkar, and we were just getting into a question and answer discussion session. Would you like to offer a few remarks at this point to the audience?
Well, I haven't seen the presentation, so I don't know. I don't know my remarks whether they will be contextual or not. But definitely, I have gone through the IEA Energy Outlook for India for 2021, and it's sort of based on what is commonly known and what was the approach which Government of India had been taking. That is, first of all, the efficiency, that is the efficiency of use of the resources, particularly in the energy terms. So increase the efficiency both in terms of generation, supply, as well as in terms of consumption. And the report or this outlook has taken note of the Government of India's program of Ujala, which is a very large program for energy efficiency, that is reducing the energy consumption, and largest program for distributing LED bulbs in place of normal incandescent or LCD bulbs. Similarly, it has also taken note of the PAT program of the for the industry, perform, achieve, and trade. That program also is for increasing the energy efficiency in the industry. Similarly, there are many other programs. So first strategy of the government is to increase the efficiency of the resources. The second one is, in terms of energy, to change the composition of energy, move more and more from fossil fuels towards renewable, and that actually has been a successful program which has been going on, and we are very well on our way to meet the NDC targets, which also have been taken note of. So these are the two main the strategies through which the India would be trading its energy pathways, and it has been taken note of. Of course, there is huge demand which is going to increase as the standard of living and the income increases. Then the energy consumption per capita is also going to increase, so that is going to put pressure on the whole system. But I am sure that our emission intensity of GDP, which is already drastically falling, it will continue to fall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gupta. If I might just sort of follow up with you and then use that to also invite Tejal back into the conversation, and I will come back to the questions from the audience. You know, one thing that Dr. Gould laid on the table quite clearly is that while India has made enormous strides through the kinds of measures you talked about, energy efficiency, the PAT scheme, and so on and so forth, a continuation of the current policy scenario would put us in a territory of where our emissions would rise considerably, but so would many other ills, such as much greater energy imports, particularly around oil, potentially much greater air pollution, and so on and so forth, So to shift to what they call a sustainable development scenario would actually require a sharp break with the current trends and a considerable ramping up of policies in a variety of ways. So, on the table is really whether India continues with what we have done, which is definitely creditable, but probably takes us into difficult terrain, or whether there's scope for a further sharp trend downward. And maybe perhaps while you reflect on this, since Tejal wanted to reflect on the earlier question, maybe I'll just invite her in briefly and then come back to you on that question, if that's okay. Tejal, why don't you quickly comment, and then I'll come back to the secretary, and then we go back to the questions.
Thanks, Navroz. I just wanted to make two quick points. One is on the RE and battery domestic manufacturing capacity. Given that we are not really spending too much on R&D, I think there is some, if we are to actually increase our domestic share of manufacturing, there has to be much more focus and spending on R&D. That is one. The other is also, I wanted to shift back to the net zero. That was the question, the framing of the net zero. And in my opinion, actually, it's very unfortunate that the entire debate on achieving these trajectories, and it started off with the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, it has net zero right in it, but the debate has definitely since last year shifted almost entirely to net zero analysis. And the net zero targets that are currently being set by countries, and they're being applauded by developed countries, definitely, they are not even 2 degrees Celsius compatible. If the US reaches net zero by 2050, they're definitely emitting much more than their fair share of the remaining carbon budget, even for the 2 degrees Celsius, let alone for 1.5. So, and then therefore, what has happened is a lot of our trajectories therefore get moderated by thinking about the targets that are being set by the US, by Germany, by the European Union, and recently by China 2060. So India, you think about net zero by around 2060, mid 2060s, and work backwards. I think that is it's unfortunate that we have to, we've been thinking about framing it in this way. Unfortunate in global terms as well, because it does not match the Paris Agreement targets. I think that's a different kind of critique of the net zero debate. It's not that net zero, whether India should reach it or not, but globally itself, the net zero takes away from the fact that what is being talked about as high ambition is really not high ambition across the board, especially from developed countries. And what it does in terms of India is that it sort of forecloses a lot of the discussion on what are the different pathways and trade-offs that are associated with those pathways as we try and ensure a just transition. And what a just transition means for us are fossil fuel energy workers, not simply set in terms of what the just transition debates coming out of the European Union are. So for what does it mean for us? So I think I just wanted to flag that.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very useful point. Can I come back to the secretary on this point about whether a dramatic change is possible, and in the terms that Dr. Kanitkar put out there, whether that's actually a reasonable ask of India?
Well, I think as far as the ramping up the policies is concerned, already the Prime Minister has set a target for 450 gigawatt by 2030. So the ramping up is already taking place, and my view is that by that time, probably the solar energy coupled with storage. Now, there are different kind of storage coupling with different kind of energies and different storage systems. Probably would be quite cheaper compared to the thermal energy cost by then. So that is one way what I look at it is, without requiring any special policy or a regulatory kind of systems, probably the economics of this will itself play out. Currently, the policy regime is imposing a renewable energy obligations on the distribution companies, and that has led to this ramping up the renewable energy systems in the country. And its contribution in the total energy basket. But as the economics of this works out, the requirement of the force regulation probably would be felt lesser and lesser. I would go back to the issue which Tejal highlighted, this debate about the net zero emissions. That actually, she rightly put it, it does not focus on the pathways to reach that and what kind of carbon budget you are going to consume by the time you reach there. And if you put together all the countries without that pathway and what carbon budget are they going to consume in reaching that pathway, it actually doesn't serve any purpose of either 2 degree or 1.5 degree. It only says by the time I will reach by 2050 or by 2060, I'll be zero net emission. But is it that you will reach that zero by, let's say, a straight line, or what kind of curve are you going to follow to reach that? And the area under that will determine the total carbon budget which you are going, carbon which you are going to emit by that time. And how does it correspond the total emission by the different countries, whether that will be sufficient to meet our 2 degree requirement or not, apart from the question of the equity, which of course is there. The equity question is going to play a very major role. So this debate, whole target setting for the net zero emission is in my view, is totally unfair and it doesn't serve the purpose. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's amazing how fast the time slips away. There's a lot to be discussed, but I think we've got into something quite interesting here around this discussion provoked around net zero. I just want to make sure I'm going to try and combine a few questions from the chat and have a second round of comments. There was a broad question put out there, which is that, you know, there may be suffusing a lot of this conversation, perhaps understandably given the tool of the model and so on, is a kind of a technological determinism, that the trick here is figuring out grid management of battery. The trick might be in the hydrogen economy and seeing how we can shift to hydrogen. These are the sorts of, you know, big chunks of the or wedges that need to be taken out of a current policy to a sustainable development policy path. But a lot of, as the IEA's presentation has showed, a lot of the future emissions and the trajectory change lies in the realm of things like urbanization, employment patterns, which are unavoidably sort of social and economic development pathways. So is there a way in which we can kind of bring these two together? So so obviously technology is important, but how do we also talk about the very complex political and social changes that lead to the kinds of demand patterns that Tim's presentation highlighted are very important in the future? So feel free to pick up any of these strands, some of the technology futures, hydrogen, grid, etc., or to pick up on this broader question of technology determinism. And maybe I'll start with you, Tim, if I may.
Thanks very much, Navroz. And of course, I mean, that's an excellent question. We are the International Energy Agency, so we tend to focus on the energy component of all of this. And just to come back to some points that Tejal mentioned earlier, we have a very detailed partial equilibrium model for energy. Technology changes are modeled within that, but there are all sorts of things that are, in a sense, external to that. And we recognize that the climate debate in particular involves elements that are not going to be captured by an energy model. They also capture things that we try and think about in addition. We have added water to this. We have added air pollution to this. We have tried to expand, in a sense, the number of issues upon which we touch. And if you compare our approach with some of the integrated assessment models, which purely look at CO2, then I think you will see that we are, we have a very rich representation of the energy-related impacts. But I completely recognize that you don't capture everything. And that is why we are trying to, in a sense, harness our energy-related insights also to the insights that you can gain from other types of modeling frameworks, whether they are general equilibrium ones or other modeling efforts that might provide a different perspective on some of these issues. And one other in a sense, it's more of a global comment on the sort of technology readiness and so on. If you look at the technologies that would be required to move us from that direction we're heading, so that sort of steps world, into a world that's compatible with Paris. So around half of those emissions come from technologies that are already either mature or fully commercialized today. But half come from stuff that is still in the prototype or demonstration phase. And that's the difficult stuff in industry. That's the difficult stuff with heavy transportation. And so, when governments put together their strategies for recovery from COVID, or when they put together their long-term energy visions, we will continually come back to this need for innovation, because bringing those technologies into the commercial sphere and bringing them at a speed that's more rapid than we've ever done in the past will be absolutely essential. And I think that's particularly relevant for India, and because I highlighted some of those areas of emissions growth in transport and industry. Some of the things that would be needed in order to tackle those problems, they're not deployed anywhere today. And, we don't yet have, iron reduction via hydrogen. The first demonstration project may come in the second half of this decade. So some of the things are being worked on as we go. But in the meantime, we recognize that, the pace of India's urbanization, the pace of its industrial needs, they require decisions now. There is that. That's another one of the challenges when you look at some of the toughest issues with regard to abatement in the future.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Ajay or Tejal?
Say the issue of urbanization. Now, clearly, from a cost perspective of the consumers or the inhabitants of the city, urbanization, which is not energy intensive, lowers the cost for everybody, the municipal bodies as well as individuals. So it makes great sense for India to get the global best practices, technologies, planners to see how to urbanize in a way where the energy consumption per capita can be kept at the lowest. And we have the late movers advantage. So we can do something which nobody else has done, because we're getting 400 million people or 500 million people into our cities in the coming decades. So there are benefits which we can replicate in areas other than where we have demonstrated success as the LED in terms of energy efficiency. So I again argue for looking at those areas where some sensible policy action could give us market-driven least cost outcomes, which are good for India and good for the world.
Great. Thank you. Tejal, and then I'll turn to the Secretary for the last word.
I do agree that there is, the question is not only of technology, and there have to be other conversations. And I think there's a fair recognition, as it's evidenced by this discussion itself, there's a fair recognition of this fact. But a lot of the important conversation in the energy sector is also about technology, and we shouldn't sort of dismiss that. Technology choices are important. And in that regard, for example, when the report itself talks about, and we have a parliamentary standing committee that talks about potential for pumped hydro storage as a potential storage option. And this is a much better complement to utility scale renewable energy technologies. And yet when most modeling studies, if you look at, I'm not just talking about IEA here, if you look at the modeling studies that have been published in the last couple of years for India, including the CEA study, there is a lot of focus on battery storage, which we do not currently have domestic capacity for. Whereas when it comes to pumped hydro storage, there are a lot of co-benefits in terms of domestically available technology that we know, labor absorption in construction, et cetera, there. So expanding the potential for that. So these become important questions. The questions of technology become important, not only as technology, but also in terms of their developmental outcomes. And so I just like to say that.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Tejal. Mr. Gupta, anything to add in particular, from your position as Secretary, Environment, in terms of focusing on particular technologies or focusing on things like large demand patterns? And maybe I could just add to that, do we have the governance structures in India today that allow us to look strategically at where the big opportunities are? Because a lot of those opportunities are actually cross-ministerial, for example, urbanization. Do we have those structures in place? And maybe you could reflect on that.
Well, let me put it this way. I will break up this issue in two parts. One part is the consumption part, where the urbanization increases, the kind of employment pattern increases. As I said, once the standard of living rises and the income rises, the increase is the energy consumption per capita that is going to happen, that is bound to happen. So urbanization is going to increase the per capita energy consumption, and that will bring in the more energy requirement in the whole system. So rather than thinking different factors, how our per capita energy is going to behave, and it is, fortunately, as Dr. Ajay Shankar has said, we have the late movers advantage in the sense that for the same standard of living, we did not spend same per capita energy which the West and other countries have done. Probably the same with the efficiencies measures which are in place and which are coming out day in and day out with the innovations. Probably for same standard of living, the per capita energy requirement would be quite less than what was there for other countries. So that is, as far as the total requirement of energy is concerned, I fully agree on the other part that some of the sectors, they are not so amenable to the renewable energy. For example, heavy transportation, particularly the commercial transportation. That is, as of now, the hydrogen technology, which again is a storage technology, seems to be quite far away. And some of these systems will continue to depend on the fossil fuels. But the technology choices, as far as the technology choices is concerned, we believe that it should be more of market driven, but definitely moving into the technology which hold the potential for the future. The cross-sectoral or cross-ministerial issues, Niti Aayog is there to take care of them, and it has actually started moving in that direction. There are a number of areas where in cross-ministerial issues we are involved. It has taken the lead, and the battery is one example. Similarly, the electric mobility is another example where the Niti Aayog has taken the lead and brought all the ministries together for the right policy framework to move in that direction. So what I would say is that these issues will have to be looked at. They have to be segregated and then tackled. And definitely, if any policy requirements are there, then we will sit down and bring in the right policy framework.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gupta. I appreciate your joining, and I know you had another meeting. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I do want to, we have lots of questions from the audience, and I do want to apologize that we were not able to dig deep into these questions. But just to give people a flavor, there were questions, for example, around the land use requirements for solar. There were questions about the assumptions on oil and gas prices and whether they are the same across scenarios. Several such questions that go into particular aspects of the modeling studies, and perhaps we can try and combine these, capture them, and send them on to the IEA, at least so they can think about those questions. We have unfortunately run out of time. I'm not going to try and sum up, but I will make the observation that I think this conversation comes at a really important moment in a sort of micro political way, because India is thinking about its NDC. We have all the sort of global conversation about it, but at a more macro way, I think the fact that India hasn't locked in too many infrastructures, the fact that we do have a potential late mover advantage, the fact that we have to think hard about urbanization and industrialization patterns, and there is a choice here. There are, and Tejal's point is well taken, that it's hard to unpack entirely the implications of those choices. The models are at the end of the day only guidance, and one has to dig a little bit deeper. But I think, would be well served in India by digging deeper and understanding the implications of these choices, and perhaps picking up from what Mr. Ajay Shankar said, thinking about this in terms of the building blocks through which we do so. So with those very brief kind of remarks, trying to bring together some of these strands, I want to thank Dr. Tim Gould, Mr. Ajay Shankar, Dr. Tejal Kanitkar, and Dr. R.P. Gupta. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you in particular to all the audience and to my colleagues at CPR who handle the back end of all of this. Thank you again, and we look forward to a future discussion with the IEA and future discussions with all of you on these and other topics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Tejal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Navroz, and very much enjoyed the conversation. Of course, much more to say. So happy to continue all of this. I'm not sure if you want to. I mean, I'll be happy to answer a few more of the questions. I was sort of typing away at the end there, trying to get answers to a few of them. But if there's a way for me to respond via you, just let me know.
Okay, great. Well, let's just compile a few of the questions, and I think we have email addresses for some of these folks, so we might even be able to kind of funnel them on. So maybe part of your listening, we can try and make that happen.
Okay, great.
Thanks
a lot.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.